Good morning, everyone. Hi, I'm Kathy O'Malley, the director of EurekAlert, and I just wanted to welcome you and thank all of you for coming to communicating science and health news across the media spectrum. I also wanted to thank our wonderful panelists for generously offering to share their time with us today. At this point, I'd like to introduce John Singh from Spectrum Science Communications, and they're our partner for the event.
Good morning. Thank you, Kathy. As Kathy mentioned, I'm with Spectrum Science Communications, and I just love this title because we managed to get our company name right in the title. So, and believe me, I had nothing to do with that, whether you want to believe that or not. But we're a 10-year-old public relations firm. We're probably the largest healthcare-only PR firm in Washington right now. And one of the things that we've been able to do over the past several years is work with outstanding talent like Rea Blakely. And Rea is joining us for the third year in a row. We're excited to have her back. She's done a fantastic job every year, at least according to the evaluations that we keep getting back, Rea. So she's scoring A+ across the board. Rea should be a household name to folks here in the Washington area. Over a 13-year period, she served as anchor and news and health reporter for WJLA, ABC affiliate here in town, and also did a good deal of national work with CNN. And I'm understanding here is a two-time Emmy Award winner, once for Best News Anchor and once for Best Host, which certainly qualifies her to conduct this morning's program. So without further delay, I'd like to present to you Rea Blakely. Thank you, Rea.
Thank you. Good morning. I am thrilled to be here for the third year, and one of my favorite things is to sort of peruse the audience, because many of you I've met before on various occasions. This, however, is a little bit different in that as the moderator, I feel a little bit like a lion tamer, because journalists quite frequently are in situations where there's a great deal of pressure to perform, to get the information, and I know that from your vantage point, you want to figure out the best way to get access to those journalists and to get your stories the attention that they deserve. And so there is this effort to engage all the energy in a positive fashion. But I have to admit that the panels that I've served on for this particular event, the journalists have been very upfront, and I know that sometimes that translates into difficult in your minds. However, you still need to work with them because obviously you can't get your information out if you don't go through this process. You can, but this is the most effective way. And so I appreciate first and foremost the fact that you are here bright and early. Second of all, that you are eager to hear what these journalists have to say. And I must tell you that, without bragging, I think this is probably the most highly qualified, best panel we've had for this particular event. So if you would, just give our journalists a round of applause in advance. We've got probably the highest caliber panel for this event that I've moderated in the 3 years, and I'm looking forward to next year for that matter to see what happens next. But before we skip ahead a full 12 months, it is my job to introduce each of the journalists and to let you know that they will be speaking on their own comments, things that they've decided are important to them to share with you to further the communication process, particularly when it comes to science and medicine. I am truly honored to hear what these folks have to say because, we can all learn something, no matter who it's from, and these folks being as qualified as they are, I'm eager to hear their comments. So I will let you know that first and foremost, one of our panelists is running a little bit late. I'll go ahead and introduce him so that when he comes in, you'll know that it's Rick Weiss from the Washington Post. Rick has been writing a science and medical reporter for many, many years, but again, he's going to be just a little bit delayed. And I'm doing this in reverse so that the last person I introduce will be the first person you hear. On the far end of the panel, currently seated, is David Braun, who is the News and Editorial Services Director at NationalGeographic.com. So we have some new media present, if you will. We're looking forward to hearing his comments. Next to him, we have John Timpane, Oh, I'm sorry. I've skipped Jim. I apologize. Jim is actually seated next. Jim is a producer for Canadian Broadcasting Corporation radio. How many of you listen to Canadian Broadcasting Corporation radio? Okay, we got a few fans in the room. He's got a couple of audio clips, I understand, he's going to share with us during his presentation. Then we have John Timpane. I've got your first names mixed up. Forgive me. John, however, is the commentary page editor for the Philadelphia Inquirer, and give him a little bit of extra applause because he's working on a bad leg today. So it may take him an extra moment to get here. He's just trying to drain you for, a little bit more clapping. So give it to him. He needs it. He's recovering. Also, we have Dr. Bernadine Healy, who is the health editor of the U.S. News World Report, and she's going to tell us actually why she switched over, as she said, from the dark side. So we're interested to hear that. And then our very first speaker this morning will be Randy Schmid, who's the science reporter for the Associated Press. And Randy shared with me that AP actually stands for Annoying People. So please applaud wildly for Randy Schmid, who's our first speaker. Ready for you.
All right, thank you.
Absolutely.
I know that your job is to try to communicate information from your agencies or institutions, wherever you work. The best way to do it, the most effective way to do it, is through the media. There's a lot of different types of media. There's new media, the internet, the old media, the newspapers, everything in between. I work for AP, the Associated Press. Quick commercial, we're the world's largest news agency. We reach every newspaper in the United States, many around the world. Almost all the broadcast media, the ones we don't reach, don't do news anyway. We're open 24 hours a day, and as I'm told, I'm not supposed to say, we're always there, we may doze, but we never close. Now, end of commercial, and on to curmudgeonly. When I joined the AP over nearly 40 years ago, most of the press people I dealt with were former journalists. I get the impression today that that's true in fewer and fewer cases. So I'm here to just run over some basic things that can be helpful, and when they're not attended to, can be extremely annoying and make it very hard for us to do our job and for you to do yours. One is timeliness. Especially in the academic community, people have a problem with getting things done in a rapid-fire manner. When we need an interview, we don't need it next week, we need it now. People often ask me what my deadline is. I work for a wire service. We need to get the news out right now. I need to talk to people as soon as possible. Earlier this week, a federal advisory committee met for a few days. Their meeting ended Wednesday. Thursday, I began getting press releases from interest groups reacting to what that panel had done. So I called the agency that ran the panel, the National Institute for Environmental Health Sciences, yesterday afternoon, asked about the meeting. They told me they were preparing a summary. I called back at 5 o'clock. Summary won't be available till tomorrow. It's already 24 hours after the meeting ended. Thursday afternoon, it might have been news. Friday, it's an anecdote for a meeting like this on how not to deal with the media. We have some heroes who know how to deal with us. Alan Leshner's one of them. Tony Fauci, Klaus Storr, Julie Gerberding. These are people that get back to us, answer our questions, know the importance of communications. We're always happy to hear from their agencies. Now, a couple of other simple things I want to talk to you about. When you send out a news release about a paper that's appearing in a journal, have copies of the paper available. We're going to want to see it. We want to read it, not just a news release. If you send out a news release on a paper appearing in a journal, tell the lead author that he's going to get calls from the press. If he's going to be on vacation, him or her, have them arrange for somebody to fill in for them, or somehow to be able to reach them. And tell them it's all right to talk to the press. You have no idea how many times I've called somebody about a paper appearing in PNAS or Science or Nature and have them say, oh, Well, I can't do an interview till I have permission from the press office. They knew the paper was appearing. You guys knew the paper was appearing. Have that permission available in advance. I asked some of my colleagues for things to talk to you about. We don't like to be double-pitched. Don't try to bring your story to people at 3 different AP offices. It causes a lot of confusion and annoyance. Sometimes people will call and tell me that one of their the story has appeared in the USA Today or the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, and wouldn't I like to do a follow-up? No. Why would I want to do a story that I've already been scooped on? We don't do disease of the week. Now, somebody said, I'm going to have to explain that. Okay. If you've got a congressperson to get a resolution through proclaiming the nastiness of Patagonian toe rot, I don't care. If you've got a nice new treatment for Patagonian toe rot, I want to hear about it. Now, if you're going to have a paper in a journal, and we work a lot of news from scientific and medical journals, and you're going to put out a news release about it, get it out early. On August 8th, I looked at the SciPac from the journal Science and found a paper in there about the knotted strings the Incas used to record information. I thought that was interesting. Over the next couple of days, I called the author of the paper and did an interview with him. I called some outside experts on the Incas that were not involved in that. We always try to get comment from outsiders if we can. Did interviews with them. I did some background research, and I had the story written on the 10th, which is when the news release from Harvard showed up. Gee, it would have saved me a lot of trouble if I'd had that a couple of days earlier. There are a couple of agencies in this town that are not good about getting press releases out before the event. If you don't send them out till after the embargo's lifted, they're of no real use to us. I won't name the agencies, but the initials NSF and NIH come to mind. Let's see. When you do have a paper with an embargo on it, this is my last point, try to get everybody on the same track. I recall a release on a diet that was supposed to help people with prostate cancers. On EureKAlert, the news release said 12:01 a.m. Pacific time. The news release that showed up from the institution said 12:01 a.m. Eastern time. So I called and asked which it was. The answer was, oh, well, I just found out the journal's already been mailed out, so there's no embargo after all. Come on. You know, it's easy to avoid these kind of things if you just all get on the same track with each other. I guess I'm not going to use up my whole 15 minutes because I've gone through what I wanted to say. I'll be happy, after the other speakers have had their say, to take questions and try to be a little less curmudgeonly.
Thus, the lion tamer effect. Randy actually hit on a couple of key points, and just to reinforce the themes there, you know, obviously news has a great deal to do with timing. We need that immediacy, which means you have to be proactive. And we feel as if we're beating a dead horse when we say it repeatedly, because it's very likely that the other panelists will mention that as well. However, that's because we're not getting the response we need. So please do keep that in mind. But I did just want to add just a note, because I worked in television primarily, and I do a little work for Discovery Health. But in regards to news, I'm not doing daily news so much anymore. But one of the things I wanted to mention, you asked about, this is the difference between the different genres of media. He would not do a follow-up story to a Newsweek piece that he's already been scooped on. However, You may have an opportunity, for example, with local television. And in Washington, local television is still the 7th largest market. So I'm suggesting to you just be aware of the audience that you're dealing with in regards to media outlets, because even though he wouldn't, it's possible that Channel 7, 4, 5, or 9 might. Just a little tidbit for you. I try to be helpful in these things. All right? Okay, so let's give Randy another round of applause, because it's not always easy for curmudgeons to relate to people, okay? So let's be respectful of that. Next, Dr. Bernadine Healy, who is now the health editor at the U.S. News and World Report. I asked her when she came in, I said, you know, I don't know if I can ask you this publicly, but I'm just curious, why? Because, you know, she was on the other side, and she mentioned the dark side. That was not for me. She said that. And so she said she'd be willing to discuss that with us, why she made that switch. So that, I hope, will be the first of her comments, among many other things. And again, we will do Q&A with each of our speakers afterwards, so take your notes, be ready, and, you know, if you feel like you really want to, you know, launch some darts, have at it. That's why they're here. So please welcome Dr. Bernadine Healy.
Thank you, Rea. No, I haven't figured out if I've moved to the dark side or to the bright side, but I hope that in both cases I was on the bright side. And I must say, in the world of communication, it's all about brightness and shedding light on things and doing it in a fair and wonderful way. I know Rea expressed sort of the shock, you know, oh my goodness, you're a journalist. I must say, I never called myself a journalist. I'm a doc. I've always been a physician, and every position I've ever held in my somewhat circuitous route through life has been as a physician and as a doctor, the heart of a doctor, the head of a doctor. And I think I bring to every position I've held, both as an administrator, as a scientist, as a doc at the bedside, always one philosophy of life, which is kind of imagine you are the patient and recognize your obligation that comes with that bond to the patient. When I was at the Red Cross, after a while, they got used to me saying, imagine you're the patient. And of course, I meant the victim. I meant the people who were serving, the people who were suffering. And in journalism, I tell my colleagues over at the magazine, imagine you're the patient. I mean, imagine you're the reader. And I think the journalists that I have come to respect and admire are ones whose sole goal is trying to enlighten and brighten the reader with their words. Now, I have had some background in media before I went full-time with U.S. News, and I must say, again, I'm just the doc. In fact, I tell Brian Kelly and Mort Zuckerman, Brian is our editor-in-chief at U.S. News and World Report, and Mort Zuckerman owns the magazine, and I just tell him I'm the physician-in-chief. Now, of course, there's only one physician at U.S. News and World Report, so it's easy for me to be the physician-in-chief. But believe me, that does carry itself out in many different ways. But I have had some exposure to the media, both as a victim of the media and someone who was covered heavily by the media. I will say, many times I felt what many of you sometimes feel: God, they got it wrong, or that was unfair. I don't like that story. And you know, God forbid, you don't want to call up and say anything about it because they'll just get you the next time. By the way, I hope this is off the record, isn't it? You don't have to take that. But, you know, journalists are human, and you always have to recognize that. But I think for the most part, I believe that journalists in the science and medical field tend to be really pretty much straight down the line. I think they tend to be very, very focused on the facts. They tend to have a marvelous ability to communicate complicated issues and complicated concepts and complicated, endless microfacts into something that is news you can use for the reader. And often we in the scientific world and the medical world stumble in that regard. And I think that often in medical and science journalism, there almost is a partnership. I don't think you see the kind of adversarial relationship that you tend to get in investigative reporting. But I also before I joined U.S. News, I have also, and all along, I've also done a fair amount of TV journalism, both with CBS and now I'm with MSNBC, and I also work with PBS. And of course, we're also doing a lot on the web, which is the other dimension of all journalism. I mean, it's become so multimedia. And as far as I'm concerned, they're just all pieces of the same. They have their dimensions of quality and benefit, and when you put them all together, you get a wonderful communication opportunity. In TV, it is really soundbite. I mean, it's what you can say in 2 minutes, and there you really have to help communicate with the producers who really drive the science reports, and you really have to communicate with succinct, concepts, with headlines. And I've come to believe that it's amazing what you really can get through, and this is where science and medical information officers can be so helpful in terms of distilling something to its bottom line. The magnificence of daily newspaper reporting, which I have never been exposed to, but I have some respect for AP and for the Washington Post, the daily magazines of the daily newspapers of high quality, because they really churn out the facts with unbelievable speed. They generally cultivate their inside methodologies. They really cultivate a network of people they can count on, and boy, they can get the leaks, they can get the, I must say, I haven't quite gotten there yet. Like, I just finished a column on avian flu, and the pandemic plan is finally, in its final draft for avian flu, is supposed to come out sometime in the next 2 weeks, and the New York Times had it in the magazine, in the paper over the weekend, and they seem to be the only one who's gotten a hold of the final version of the pandemic flu plan that Secretary Leavitt is going to release as soon as next week. Now, as far as I'm concerned, it's just a modification of the existing draft. From what I can tell, it hasn't changed significantly, but there is something kind of sexy about one news magazine and one journalist getting a hold of this leaked document that no one else has. I mean, that's kind of the macho of journalism. I don't tend to play that game just because I don't have to. I mean, and also I wouldn't like to do it. I mean, it's not the way I am. I mean, my feeling is, if Leavitt doesn't want to give me his plan, tough. I mean, I will write about something else. And I think that does get back to a way you communicate with journalists. You have to be helpful to them. I mean, if you have a document you can give them, we don't break the law by doing it, give it to them. I mean, I think that one of the biggest mistakes universities and scientists and physicians make is they kind of clam up, and they're afraid just to be straightforward. And I think journalists can figure out when you're being straight with them, and the more you can give them documentation. If there's a document, I mean, why in the world should the avian pandemic flu document, which has been floated around to thousands of people, not just be out there? Why? Not for me, not for members of this panel, not for everybody but the New York Times, but more importantly, because this is an evolving process. Let me tell you, there's no pandemic plan that isn't going to change every single step of the way, and if that horrible event occurs in this country, if we are faced with a massive pandemic with numbers that they are predicting conservatively, with as many as 60 million people exposed and potentially 2.5 to 7 million hospitalizations and 500,000 to 1 million deaths. I hear the president using these numbers. If that occurs, there are no secrets, and nothing should be kept a secret. So I think that I will just say, in a weekly magazine, we also are less. We have more time, and there is an obligation, I think, in weekly magazines to go into depth on issues. And certainly at U.S. News, there is increasingly a focus on doing the in-depth. We're not competing with the daily. We're not here to get the scoops or to make sure we get up on our web before anybody else does the latest story. But that is an opportunity, I think, for PIOs, because that means that you really can go into more depth. You can spend more time. You can have more conversations. I think that getting back to my belief, you have to remember that, again, always imagine you're the patient. I think the ultimate goal of good journalism and good doctoring is that you know who you're serving, and the goal is to get the right facts out to the public and to do it in as digestible a way I've heard it said that print, I learned this when I was at NIH, that print drives TV. That is to a certain extent still the case, but I think increasingly the networks with their websites and other things have developed more robust organizations. And I personally tend to think of the media now in its multi-dimensional way, and it doesn't matter which it is. They're all phenomenal vehicles for communication. I would just like to mention, because I don't want to run over, that I'm going to give you just two examples of things that I still am troubled with a bit, but I'm not really troubled. It's almost a phenomenological observation about things that happen in reporting information that I think are often, they just get spun the wrong way from the beginning, and it's very hard to get the light out. They're not necessarily relevant to you, but they just came to mind when I saw one of the questions that was listed. What do you consider? What was this question? What tips can you offer when you're looking at complex and controversial stories? And we do cover a lot of controversial stories, and I think sometimes they do get off track. The Schiavo case is one that comes to mind. This actually had a very, very complicated neuroscience dimension to it that I think was completely inadequately covered. I did several columns on that and did a lot of TV on that because for some reason, I seemed to be the only one who was absolutely focused on the fact that they were throwing around the wrong diagnosis. That doesn't mean she wasn't severely handicapped mentally. It doesn't mean that she probably didn't have a mental age of maybe 1 year old. But there is a difference between being brain dead and having minimally conscious state. There is a difference. But that difference really wasn't really sorted out by neurologists until about 2002. And the fact of the Schiavo case is she never had an evaluation on the latest criteria of minimally conscious state. So the neurologist, one in particular, who was the guy who was the media star, who kept saying, I saw her, she was brain dead, she had flat EEGs, he kept repeating that on television and the newspaper. I had, and this one I got a lot of leaked information, I had medical records. She did not have a flat EEG. She probably was. She was, from everything that can be determined, at least in my evaluation of the medical records, and speaking to doctors who were with her, she probably was minimally conscious. She was not brain dead. I've taken care of brain dead patients. I've turned off the respirators on brain dead patients. She did not fall into that category. And this neurologist, with all of his mighty standing and university affiliations, really carried the day. And at autopsy, her autopsy, I think, didn't get the proper play. She did have neurons in her frontal lobe. Sure, there weren't a lot of them, but she had them. She was totally without neurons in her occipital lobe, which is where your vision is. So and I spoke to the medical examiner, terrific pathologist who did the case, and he said, she was blind. Well, half of the evaluation that they kept using, remember that ball they kept having this woman watch? They said, she can't follow this ball. She can't retain eye contact. That means she's brain dead. Well, wait a minute. If you're blind, it's awfully hard to do that. But she did have, based on the autopsy, there was evidence that she probably had neural tracts and could hear. And that's why perhaps she was able to react when people got up into her face. I'm just throwing that out, that I think that this became a soundbite. This woman is brain dead, black and white. The people who are against this, who want to keep her alive, are a bunch of nuts from the right wing. I happen to be pro-choice, but it was turned into a pro-life story. And the science did not win the game. And I think a lot of people, because it was charged with ideological things like pro-choice, pro-life, the right to lifers and their signs, blah, 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 I think a lot of scientists were unwilling to engage this issue straight down the line in terms of the scientific facts. Did it matter? I don't know. As a physician, I speak as a physician, and I speak here as someone who thinks that the scientific facts were butchered in that case. But I think basically there is a difference between turning off a respirator on a 1-year-old child and someone who is brain dead. There is a difference. I say that ethically, I say that as a physician, and I say that from a scientific perspective. That was one that I think my columns were voice in the wilderness, and what I do really enjoy about doing columns, I occasionally do just straight reported pieces, but in columns I combined what we call reported pieces, namely, you get the information, you talk to people, as I did until 3 in the morning on my piece for next week. but you basically can put your opinion in. I would not be in this if I were, I'm not a reporter. My reporter colleagues have been so good to me. They've made me a better writer. They've helped me in the methodology of journalism, and they even call me a journalist, which I don't feel I've earned those credentials. I'm a doc, and I'm trying to communicate to 12 million people through my column. They're my patients. But I think that the important thing for all of us, and this is where we're in partnership, all of us up here, all of you, is that the goal is to serve those people who are trusting us, needing our information, needing our ability to translate facts, and bottom line, something that gets into their hearts and into their heads and maybe changes the way they live for the better. Thanks.
Now, obviously, Dr. Healy does have an interesting perspective in that she brings her physician attitude to everything that she does. But I would imagine if I were sitting in your seats as a PIO, this would be somebody I'd want to have constant contact with to get my issues out. Am I incorrect in that? Is anybody feeling that? Okay, just me. All right, interesting. Okay. Because, one of the great opportunities here, and I did mention this to someone who came up before the event started, handed out her card to all the panelists. I said, what I think most PIOs seem to miss in actual practical application is the opportunity. So often we wait. We wait. But journalists are looking for you to give us in advance. And so, as I say, I would be all over Dr. Bernadine Healy, myself, if I were a PIO. Because surely there's an academician, there's a researcher, there's a scientist who's going to have some material that I want to try and get out through her column if I'm a PIO. But guess what? I'm not. So maybe that's why I don't have your perspective on it. But to me, that's part of what needs to be engaged here, is the idea that you have an opportunity. It's not just journalists who are going out seeking people to do interviews. You really have to be proactive about it so that you have the opportunity. Because the other thing is, journalists are busy and we don't always take your calls. Has anybody had that experience? Okay. All right. Just me and John. Okay, great. All right. Next, actually, and we'll give him just a moment to start preparing himself to make his way. We have John Timpane, who is the contemporary page editor for the Philadelphia Inquirer. Now, John came down on the train this morning, so he's been up bright and early for a while. He is with us despite the fact that he is basically missing a quadricep. Did I have that correct? Okay. It snapped, broke, pulled. It's not functioning as well as it should. Nonetheless, here's the caveat to this. It happened when he was at a writers' conference in Maui, so too bad for him, right? Please give him a round of applause for John Timpane.
Okay, I am the op-ed editor for a newspaper of 400,000 readers daily and twice that on Sundays. But like most newspapers, we're now a world newspaper. People read us all over the place through the web, and our stuff gets disseminated to whomever come who may all over the world. And I think that's one of the reasons why the first point I want to make is there's no such thing as only print media anymore. We make jokes about dead tree media, but actually all media is all media. There's unprecedented overlap. Think about this as I dive into my point, which is that all of you should begin to think like me if you want to sell to me. If you want to sell pieces to me, begin to think like me. Think like an editor. All right, what is my life like? I get up to the radio playing NPR News, and it's playing the news of the day. And that's what I want in my damn page tomorrow, is what I'm hearing this morning. So listen to the news of the day and say to yourself, what does John want? What is John really wanting? Because I want to look smart. I want my page to look smart. So that means that the next day, let's say, the avian flu, or the Evian flu, as people are talking about it. Have you noticed this? The Perrier pathogen. Have you heard this? The Evian flu. It's unbelievable. I love it. The avian flu. If that breaks out in Washington today, I want to look smart. I want to have a piece on it tomorrow. If you've got somebody in your organization who's really big on bird stuff, kick that person's butt and get a 700-word piece and get it to me. In other words, you've got to start thinking about, what editors think about, what they want. Think this. I sit down to my computer screen in the morning. I have 600 submissions already. 600 op-ed submissions. 1% of them will get on the page. No, I do not read all of them. I don't have any help. Most people like me have no help. So we have to make some brutal, inhumane cuts. What is my first cut? Topic. I just go down the list looking at who's, Guatemalan copper futures. No! Right? Avian flu. Yes! Right? So, think about it. Topic. That's the first thing that I do. I know what I'm looking for, and I just make that brutal cut, get it down to, after the first hour where I'm going, ding, 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 ding. I'm looking for the topics I'm interested in, and it's the first cut. What did I hear on the radio this morning? What is my job like? Think. So the topic is the first cut. I'm looking for 700-word essays that make a powerful claim about an urgent news event and back it up with a persuasive argument. That's what I'm looking for. That claim has to be made early in the piece. Academic writers specialize in the 400-word opening sentence. Train your writers not to do that. I won't run that. I will not run that. And if I do run that, that is the first thing I will cut. I need to get to that claim early. I need to get to the thesis statement early. What we call at our newspaper, different places have different names for it, the nut graph. That is a statement of one of three types. 1, something is or is not good, true, or worthy. 2, look what happened. Here's why. 3, predictions and warnings. 80% of op-ed pieces fall into one of those 3 categories. Keep your eye out on the news. Think about who in your organizations can write about those things. Because one of the things, I've just talked about topic, I just mentioned thesis. The third thing I'm looking for is standing. What standing means is the writer who has a direct connection with a news event, either through personal experience or expertise. So, again, the avian flu. A person who either has had it, oh, that'd be cool, or has treated it, that'd be nice, who has been in Gwangju province, where a lot of, flus arise, oh, that'd be nice. Somebody who has worked with birds, ornithologists who've had the flu, I don't care. If you've had somebody who has standing, real standing, you know what I'm talking about. Get him or her to write as quickly as you can. Who do you got? Think about that. Who do you got? What do we not like? We don't like pieces that are free commercials. We here at the Society for the Moment really believe... No. No free commercials. We do not run that. Self-serving paragraphs, those little sort of... That's not what we're here for. We're here for pieces that have impact. And by impact, what I mean is that they can change people's thinking, get them to think about something they hadn't thought about before, or affect policymakers. Strangely enough, my page affects policymakers' decisions. I don't know why. It always bemuses me to see this. But I'll run a piece and then have Rick Santorum in my office the next day. It's unbelievable. And... usually hating me a lot, but that's okay. That's part of the territory. I'm looking for impact. I'm looking for somebody to say something and make an argument. By the way, what is an argument? Argument is an assertion followed by reasons, right? In 700 words, you get 1 or 2 of those reasons, right? But they ought to be good ones. My other big thing I want to talk about is perfect the art of the pitch, and I'm going to give you a technique. It is so irritating that it works. It's called the email sandwich. Basically, it's call, submit, call. You call me, you get my direct line, and you tell me your name, the author of the piece, and you give me the topic and the thesis in 10 to 15 seconds. Hello, Mr. Timpane. My name is John Jones from the X Association. I am pitching you a piece by Dr. Blank Blank on the avian flu, in which he argues, and then you give me that statement, 10 to 15 seconds. So I have it all. I have the topic, I have what you're saying about it, I have the person who's writing it. Got the whole thing in my hands. And then send it, and then call me back and say, I just wanted you to know that I've just emailed you that piece that I pitched you only 2 minutes ago. Do it. No, do it. Because now you have done something which is humanly effective. You have created guilt. You have told me you were going to send it. You sent it. And then you called me up to tell me that you sent it. Now I know that you've sent it, damn it. I know that I've got it. I know what it says. So I know I have to make a decision. It works. It's very irritating. Very irritating. Very irritating. Unprecedented presence for science and health issues on the op-ed pages of American newspapers now. And many more op-ed editors are a lot like me. They have science backgrounds. They know what's going on. They are science writers, a lot of them. I was for many years. And think about all of the science issues that are out there. Stem cell research, end-of-life issues, nanotech, cosmology, space exploration. Right now in Pennsylvania, just a few miles from my office, we're having the Scopes trial redux, aren't we? A judge could actually rule that Darwin has to move over and make way for something else. Well, that's pretty interesting. Evolutionary biology is on my page an awful lot. Like New York, like Boston, like Washington, Philadelphia has a lot of great health and science institutions all over the place. We've got lots of people who want to write for me about these things. So it's of the moment. Never has science been so much in the public eye. People are really worried about viruses of all sorts, aren't they? Have you ever noticed how many viruses are now heroic figures in the news, right? Many people on the street can now say retrovirus, for example, right? But how many people can say nanotech? And nanotech is big, and there's ethical issues coming out of nanotech. It's very big. So if you've got a materials scientist who can write about the ethical issues of nanotech, I'd love to read that. My final point is to be prepared and agile. Turn on a dime. If there are institutional reasons why you can't get your piece to me, talk to the people who are responsible for those reasons so that you can give yourself greater ability to get straight to me. And I think each of the people who've spoken so far have made this point. You've got to be able to turn on a dime if news breaks. You've got to be able to get to somebody and say, listen, I just saw this. I think I can sell this to John Timpane. What do you say? Do not lead with press releases. I won't read them because I can't. Because remember those 600 pieces? I just got 200 more. I mean, the pressure of the world submission rate. Don't lead with press releases because I can't read them. Put your topic in the subject field. Don't say essay by Dr. Blutz. That works really well. Essay by Dr. Blutz. Say, essay on avian flu. Perrier pathogen. Do not lead with a query. Lead with a finished piece. You know why? Because if you lead with a query, you will lose out to the person who led with a finished piece. Ain't my job. It's yours. Train your writers. If you have writers who are smart but not good writers, find a way to talk to them. There's a writer I have in my mind at a major American university who sends us impenetrable stuff. I read this and I think, I know it's English, but why? Why do I know? And he's writing, and he's smart. He's very smart, and he's used to being the smartest person in the room because he always is where he lives, right? But there are other human beings. There are other people in the world, and they don't understand him, and I don't either. And so what I've tried to do is call his secretary and say, listen, about Dr. Blutz, not his real name. we got to talk. He's got to say something in his pieces. They can't just be overviews. They can't be demonstrations of how smart he is. He actually has to be making. By the way, don't do those things either. He can't show off. He's got to be saying something. It's got to be almost immediate. It's got to be right up at the top of the piece, and then he's got to prove it. He's only got 700 words. Can you work with him? Can you give him my freshman English book, Writing Worth Reading, from St. Martin's? And if you have somebody and you know they don't write well, find a way to get that message to them. They've got it. They are competing with hundreds of other excellent writers now. So, find a way to get the message to them. Because you want to compete with that rush of pieces. And I'm now finished. Thank you very much.
I love John. He cuts to the quick, yet it's all very useful information. I saw a number of you taking notes. So I pose this question again. How many of you feel as if you truly need to make an impact with the journalists that you've heard so far and the physician by contacting them directly regarding your agency, the efforts that are underway wherever you work, whoever you're representing? How many of you feel the need to do that? Okay, now we're penetrating. Now we're getting somewhere. And the reason I reinforce that is because so often we do get comfortable in our own little worlds, and we feel as if, we have the best researcher, we have the best academician, we have whatever it is, and they will come hunting us. But this is one of the things I tell people. The media is very much like a prom queen. You must seek us. We have 600 emails a day. We have, 200 people calling. We are bombarded with your press releases. And our job is to sift through as quickly as possible the stuff we know we're not going to do. So when you wonder, okay, I've spent 3 hours after 3 weeks of committee meetings perfecting this press release, why they didn't respond, we're telling you why. Because we need immediacy. We need timeliness. We need you to respond to our needs because we are the prom queen. So once you truly grasp that and put it into every thought in regards to dealing with somebody who's a member of the media, you will be much more effective in getting your message out through us. Big caveat that I think a lot of people get comfortable with at a certain stage in their careers, like early on. And then we develop a sense of power and authority, and we think they're going to chase us. They want us. We're NIH. Well, we want you, but we can find other ways around you if you're not receptive to our needs. So just keep that in mind. And it's not, again, it's a little bit of the lion tamer thing. I'm not trying to club you over the head with it, but I think on occasion we need a refresher course. And that's what these kinds of meetings are about, how to communicate effectively. So the thing that I really like about what John said was the email sandwich, because if you don't use that, shame on you. The man told you he gets 600 emails a day. He's going through the stuff first thing in the morning looking for a reason why to get you off his plate. If you don't do that, you ought to be fired. Okay? Just keep that in mind. Now, let's see what Jim Lebans brings to us. Jim represents radio on this panel today, a producer from the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. I understand he's got a couple of examples in regards to audio clips, so God forbid if you should hear your researcher or your scientist or whomever. I'm not sure if they're positive or negative, but let's bring on Jim and see what he's got for us.
My name's Jim Lebans, and I'm a producer at the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation's radio science program, Quirks and Quarks. And since obviously we're not much heard on your airwaves, some of you may not know much about us. The CBC is, of course, Canada's public broadcaster, and in many ways we're different from NPR. I think compared to NPR, we probably have a higher profile across the country. Washington obviously rules, and NPR obviously rules in Washington. The CBC does both TV and radio under one roof, for one thing. We're not separate like PBS and NPR. Our TV network shows hockey, which would be equivalent here, I guess, to having Monday Night Football broadcasts with a halftime show that included pledge drives and offers of Ken Burns videos. The radio network that I'm part of actually leads the ratings in some of our major cities and most of the smaller ones because we have a lot of local regional programming.
The program I help produce is a 1-hour weekly science show with an audience in Canada that gets up to about 500,000, which is pretty respectable for our little country. We've also in the past been carried in an irregular syndication by various public radio stations in the U.S., thanks to the miracle of the Internet, where we've recently been experimenting with audio downloads and podcasting, and though the Internet community still represents a small but closely watched part of our audience. And if you're interested in any of this, check out our website. There's lots of great stuff there. There isn't much like our program, as far as I can tell, in the U.S. We've been on the air now for about 30 years, though my tenure has been a little bit shorter than that. The format of the show is one of relatively long-format interviews of 6 to 8 minutes with working scientists. We also do slightly longer documentary format pieces based on multiple interviews to get different perspectives on complex issues. And these interviews are generally with the kind of researchers that you work with. They're university-based, associated with usually publicly funded or non-profit research institutes, and we become interested in their work usually because it's published in the scientific literature, and notice that publication comes to us through the journals or through organizations like the AAAS and EureKAlert. My job as a producer is to look for stories, make initial contacts with potential guests for the program, write background and interview questions for our host, and edit the interview once it's been recorded. Now, the key element in the program that in our programs that we try and have the scientists do their own talking. There's no reporter sort of narrating, there's no voiceovers. Each piece has a short introduction, but it's a discussion between our host and the scientist that has to carry all of the information about the research and most of the context for understanding it and why it's important. And this is a heavy burden to put on scientists whose area of expertise is not always communication, obviously, and whose research can be complex and occasionally esoteric. We have a secret, however, to bringing out the best in these people, and that is that we cheat. We cheat in many different ways. We cheat in the kinds of stories we choose, because sometimes certain things you just can't explain without diagrams or video or voiceovers or sidebars and all those tricks that people in print and TV get to use. We cheat by preparing the guests, sometimes rigorously. We'll have lengthy discussions before the interviews in which we negotiate what we're going to talk about and how we're going to approach it, and even what analogies we might use to get over the harder bits. And of course we cheat by editing, and we typically record for the 6 to 8 minute standard interview that we do at least 15 minutes of discussion. I should say that in my experience most people don't actually notice the editing. They think they're that articulate automatically. Those that do notice it generally seem to appreciate it. And finally we cheat by throwing stuff away. We throw away stories before we call people, after we've spoken to them, close to half the time after we've recorded an interview, because even with the preparation and editing, it just sometimes doesn't work. So what I'd like to talk about today is how you can help us cheat. And I hope some of this is new to you. I know that there are people out there who have worked in broadcast and print. And I also hope that this doesn't just apply to my program, but to the CBC in general, in case you want to talk to Canadian. So there are lots of different programs on CBC and current affairs, and lots of them deal with science and health issues. And maybe actually the same techniques that I'm going to talk about will apply to NPR and BBC and some of the other radio outlets that you probably deal with. Now, the most important thing for you to understand is that our goal in radio is generally to create a conversation. That's very important to us. In the late 60s and early 70s, there was something called the radio revolution. Radio was dying. There was this new medium called TV that everybody thought was just going to blow radio out of the water. And so we had to try and change and find a new way to communicate with people using radio. We changed the style. So out the window went the stilted and dramatic presentation that we now associate with film newsreels. And the new approach was to have conversations with people telling stories. Radio programs stopped talking at people and started talking with them, creating much more intimate and much more accessible kind of programming. It was a huge success, and of course it's the same thing that's happening in radio and television. It's still the model we follow today. So the best radio, we think, is the kind that gives you the impression that you're a silent listener at a kitchen table listening to a debate of intelligent, articulate, amusing, and passionate people who are basically telling stories. And achieving this intimate, familiar tone of the kitchen table isn't easy. Some people can do it automatically. Some interviewers, just by their personalities and their expertise, can create the tone and encourage it in the people they're speaking with. But it's important to realize that this is naturalistic. It's not natural. It's a kind of performing, and it's easy for some people, but harder for most. Most people are naturally inhibited by nervousness and self-consciousness when they sit down in front of a microphone with a live radio audience out there. And so we have to encourage conversation and storytelling and draw it out. So I'd like to talk about how we could do that. one of the questions is, where does this leave us in trying to cover science stories if we're trying to have conversations? Often in a difficult place because the material's not the stuff of the kitchen table chat necessarily. And of course we have all the editorial concerns of any other broadcaster or writer. Our mandate is to cover stories of public interest and scientific significance. And so by and large we recognize that the same things are important for our program as are for the Discovery Channel or the New Scientist or the New York Times. An important exception for us, of course, is that as a Canadian program we have a bias to Canadian stories, Canadian research, and stories of local interest to Canada. I mean, local for the second biggest country in the world. And we are like other outlets. We try and do things that are unique for us. For us, those are things that, befitting the title of our program, which is Quirks and Quarks, a little quirky, offbeat, counterintuitive, surprising. You can think of that when you're thinking about whether or not you want to pitch to us any particular story. And of course, the filter is whether this story can lend itself to a conversation, an 8-minute discussion of what the research or discovery is and how the work was done and what the context for understanding is and why it's important. These things are the facts around which a conversation can be based, so there's more to it than that. Ideally, I'll know most of this before I ever talk to the researcher, and I'll know it because I've read the paper and maybe I've read some particularly well-written press release composed by a thoughtful person like some of you, or perhaps a news report from one of my slightly swifter off-the-mark colleagues. But there are other things I'll look for. I'll look for signs of charm or humor. Perhaps that's inherent in the material. The title of the paper might be funny. That happens rarely, but it's usually a sign of a winner. Maybe it's an animal behavior story that lends itself to cheap jokes about human behavior. Animal sex stories make a lot of our programming. Perhaps there's something in a quotation or a release that makes it look as if the person could be interesting or entertaining to listen to. Perhaps there's an anecdote, a bit of personal information, some sign that the research was done under interesting circumstances that might lend themselves to part of this conversation that I'm talking about. So what I'm looking for is obviously in many ways incidental to the research and its scientific significance, which is that's got to be there. That's the meat of the story. But not every important story, not every story is that important. They're the earth shakers. They're going to make it on the program anyway, but there's a lot of other stuff. And what's going to determine what I choose in that other stuff is how I can wrap it in some senses. And that's not what qualifies a story for science or nature or PNAS. Again, these elements for conversation are important, and they're important because they're what attract people to the story and capture their attention and draw them in. If the research, if the research is important, that might not matter. So what does this mean in terms of the kinds of stories we do? And all of this kind of biases us to biology, for example, more than chemistry or physics, maybe space stories more than ones about material science. A conversation about finding an endangered species in a tropical rainforest or an Arctic lake makes for a better story for us than maybe this year's Nobel Prize in chemistry. Though we'd certainly try and do the story about the Nobel Prize, but if we did it, we'd create a conversation about it. It'd be about rich in details of the person's life in sciences and their recollections, and probably fairly poor in the details of metathesis and its role in organic chemistry. And there's a tension for us here at Editorial, of course. The best stories, as I've characterized them, and the most important ones don't precisely coincide. And we have to take care against doing stories that make a great discussion but really don't matter otherwise. There's also a tension for the scientists we interview. For them, their work matters. And that's what they're most interested in talking about them. And we have to help them understand that the best way to ensure that their work is going to be understood and appreciated in the context that we present it in is by getting people to listen to this conversation and this story. And for a paleontologist who studies the morphology of dinosaur eggs, we might need to know about the difficulties of working in China, where the best fossils are found, a reconstruction, as they might imagine it, of the nest where the eggs might have laid, or what it felt like when they held a 150 million year old egg in their hands for the first time. That's the sugar that helps the medicine go down. So what we look for in a guest in a story, and so what do we look for in a guest in a story, and what can you do in helping us get the story out? Well, the first thing we look for is a good talker. These are the people who understand, perhaps because of long experience or just because of talent, how to tell a story, and they naturally slip into the mode of conversation that I've talked about. And you know these people, and you don't often have to do much to try and sell their stories. If they've anything at all to say, they'll say it well, and often with them their best press release is just a transcript of the most entertaining things you've heard them say. More likely the researcher you're working with is less gifted in communication, and then the strategy needs to change. And if you have the time, I'd suggest you spend time working out how they might talk about their research as a story. And I'll talk a little bit about how you might do that. If you don't do that, you might end up with something like this. I brought one example. we can make this work. This is a clip from an interview we did about
ADS-CFT correspondence
on parallel
de Sitter space-time and gravity in an asymptotically anti-de Sitter space-time, never mind what that space-time is, corresponding to some so-called conformal field theory, which is an ordinary non-gravitational theory.
What the heck are you talking about?
So,
okay. That last comment was the host of our program,
this
Bob
idea,
McDonald.
we're going to have to take
speaking, I think,
problem
for all
in
of us.
quantum mechanics.
Let me just stop this now. I mean, he really did that in an interview. Obviously, this man was not prepared by people like you to know what it was that he had to do to explain what he was talking about. I mean, what he was talking about was complicated. It was parallel universes. Like I produced the documentary. I still don't know what he was talking about. What this illustrates, of course, is that the first thing is for you to make sure that you and the researcher both know how to explain the story. And maybe you're lucky and that won't be difficult, but often it's the biggest problem, especially as science has developed in the last decade and fields like genetics and quantum physics and, well, pretty much everything else have become more complex. Complexity is a problem you can deal with in different ways. You can try and fight through it and develop all the detail you need for understanding, and that can work. But more likely what will work best is if you negotiate, sometimes arduously, the best way to simplify the work. I do this a lot with researchers, and it consumes a huge amount of time, so I only do it with the most important or the most promising stories. They explain it to me. I try and explain it back to them. They say, no, that's not right, and explain it to me again. And this process can go on for a long time, either telephone or over email with drafts, and I'll suggest analogies, and they'll correct the analogies or suggest new ones. And finally, we get it to something that satisfies them because it's accurate and satisfies me because our audience might actually understand it, and it can be regurgitated in 60 seconds or so. And I'm telling you this because I want you to do it instead of me. It'd be great if you could, because it's one more barrier to getting the story on air. If I have to do this with every story, I can look at the story in the press release and think, oh, no, it's never going to work. I can hear 2 words from the researcher on the phone and think, writing this one off. If you prep them, maybe that won't happen. So one of the other reasons that you should do it is because you're on their side. You're working with them. You should be challenging them to be better communicators and helping them, holding their hands and negotiating with them to get this complex idea dialed in. Again, this is different from writing a release. When you write a release, it's because you understand the story, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the researcher knows how to explain the story as well as you have. You've got to make sure that they can explain it. Another problem that we face is because of the depths of modern research that is plumbing these days, even important advances are incremental. To an outside observer, they might even be insignificant. And as a result, it's not at all uncommon for 4/5 of one of our interviews to be essentially background, an explanation of what you need to understand before we can even start to get into the research that we're ostensibly talking about. Nearly every interview that we do contains its own primer in the field we're discussing. And so we're limited by time and patience to how much detail of a discovery or an advance we can discuss. Recent example I did was an interview with someone who developed a material important for quantum optics because it could basically throttle light. It had special properties that made it particularly valuable in something called quantum cryptography, which I won't just try to explain. So we spent 6 minutes of the interview setting him up for a question which was basically, so you've invented a material that emits single photons to make this all possible, to which his answer was yes. And that was it. His explanation of a 3-year research project was 1 word. And we didn't dare ask another question. So that's the content, the real stuff we're trying to communicate. Now let's get to the other stuff. We need to try and figure out what would help to try and frame the story, to help turn it into a narrative or an interesting yarn. And my advice to you is to try and, as you try and do my job for me, is to ask a bunch of questions about the researcher. Walk through the history of the field, of the work, of how they became interested, or what they were inspired, how they were inspired to do it. Was it a long fascination, or did they fall into it by accident? And maybe they hate it, and that could work too. So did they gather the data for the field for this in the field or in the lab? Were there mishaps, comical moments, disasters, adventures? What were the ups and downs? Maybe they were appalled to be assigned this research project as a graduate student and spent months on boring and apparently fruitless research, dragging themselves to the lab and consuming massive amounts of coffee and Skittles until finally there was a eureka. So invite them to be self-deprecating and funny and exhilarated. For a scientist or a graduate student, this sort of thing is far from second nature. Many feel the need to appear serious and professional, and that's understandable. They've spent their career on this work. They don't want to look foolish to their colleagues or a national radio audience. On the other hand, if they can't find ways to charm and amuse and excite and tell their story well, you can be sure that more people, if you can find ways to do that, more people will hear about the work and find it interesting. The last thing I have to say is that one of the issues is about having you do this rather than me is that people don't always believe me when I tell them this. The researchers don't always believe me. They're inhibited by the process. They're inhibited by the fact that they don't know me and don't trust my motives. Your job is to make these people look good and reflect credit on them and your institutions. And if you believe that telling stories this way is a good idea, they might believe you sooner than they'd believe me. My job is to make my show sound good, not to make the researchers look good or the institutions look good. Those don't necessarily have to be objectives that are in conflict, but sometimes they are. So they'll believe you if you tell them that this is the way to tell stories. Have I got any more time? There's one last clip I'd like to play.
One last clip.
Okay, it's about a minute long, and it actually isn't relevant at all. I've been locked out for the past 2 months. The CBC had a labor dispute where they locked out 5,500 employees, all the production and reporting staff, abandoned correspondents all over the world, and that sort of thing. So I didn't have access to all the sound clips that I'd like, so I just brought something silly. But maybe it will illustrate sort of the kind of thing we do on our program to try and make difficult issues a little easier to understand. This is going to work.
Well, to explore this idea, we're going to have to take a sidestep and look at a fundamental problem in quantum mechanics. And for that, I need a cat. Hello, kitty. Okay, now you might have heard of this one. It's called the Schrodinger's cat dilemma, and it's based on a thought experiment proposed by Erwin Schrödinger, one of the founders of quantum mechanics. So to begin, we just need to stuff this cat in a box. Carefully. Oh, shit. In there. Get it. Now, inside this box, I've already got a vial of poisonous gas. Yeah, and a source of radioactive atoms. Now, we'll just close up the box and wait for the cat to calm down. Right. Here we go. The box is completely closed. You can't see inside. Now, here's the dilemma. There's a 50-50 chance that one of the radioactive atoms in the box will decay, and when it does, it will trigger the gas to be released, thus killing the cat. But without opening the box, how can you tell if the cat is alive or dead? Well, the short answer is you can't. And mathematically, the cat is stuck in a sort of limbo, neither dead nor alive, until I open the box. Right, let's open the box, and out jumps the cat. I said, out jumps the cat. Alive. Whew.
I should tell you, no real cats were harmed in the making of that program. We did get a lot of letters.
Jim, that was worth the length. Thank you very much. Jim Lebans, all right. David Braun is our next speaker, who is News and Editorial Services Director for NationalGeographic.com. I think the interesting thing as he approaches the podium is the fact that we're all really talking about storytelling in a variety of ways. I think perhaps our last example was the best way of going about explaining it to you. But I bet there's still more good information to come. So please welcome him.
Thank you. So many good things have been said already that I wanted to say, and I won't because it will be redundant, except a few things that I do want to emphasize. I wanted to tell you first a little bit about how we fit into the National Geographic Society. Everybody's familiar with that brand, but they're not so familiar with what we do in National Geographic News on our website. National Geographic, the society, everybody knows us as a magazine or as a great television channel, but the society actually has 5 magazines. It publishes 80 books a year, has 2 international channels, and we reach 250 million people worldwide. We're also one of the world's largest scientific and educational non-profits. The profits that are made from our media operations are turned back into research and exploration. We fund 200 scientific research projects every year. Probably many of your institutions have been associated with us in this research, and many of my colleagues sitting here I know have reported on National Geographic funded research. Some of our research has been published through Science, Nature, and PNAS, and many other journals. So we often see our research coming back to us through this incredibly useful service to journalists, EurekAlert. That's my advertisement for the sponsors today. NationalGeographic.com is the aggregation of some 22 entities of the society, all the magazines, the TV, the books, etc. And together there's something like 100 to 300,000 pages on our site. Nobody knows for sure because so many people are building the site, it just proliferates. But within that is what I do, National Geographic News. We're not associated with any other part of the society. We're an independent medium. And you need to be clear in understanding that when you pitch stories to us, you're not pitching to the magazine or to the books division. And that's not to say, though, that the other units of the society are not monitoring us. Just yesterday in the lunch line, I was talking to a senior assistant editor on the magazine. He's the lead editor for archaeology and paleo, and he told me that what we do on our news site is one of his primary sources for information for the magazine. So we can be an entry point to the other units of the society. NationalGeographic.com started its news division. I started it 5 years ago, 1 story a day. We now do 5 stories a day. We're growing this. This year we're growing our news page consumption. That's a combination of visitors and the amount of stories each visitor reads by 70%. News consumption on our site's up 70% this year over last year, and we're budgeting to be 50% up next year. So this is a hugely proliferating medium. We have 5 editors full-time now who process stories that are sent to us and that we assign or are pitched to us by some 30 contributors around the world, most of them in the United States. We tend to go for National Geographic type stories, like on the tsunami. Obviously, the human suffering was very important, and we ran those stories first. But where we truly found our stride was getting into the geography of the tsunami, and we were one of the first news outlets to focus on how the animals had reacted to the tsunami. We got enormous traffic from the internet by focusing on what you would expect National Geographic to cover in a major event like the tsunami or Katrina, when all other media are already covering this. Katrina, similarly, we obviously would be experts on hurricanes because the Society funds hurricane research, and we've published a lot over 116 years on weather disasters like that. Like everybody else, we knew Katrina was bearing down, we started publishing stories about that. We floated to the top of Google News. I don't know if you're familiar with Google News. You should be. If you aren't, you should be looking at that just about every hour, because it tells you what 4,000 news media in the world are publishing at that time, and it aggregates through computers what the main news stories are. And all these people here, I know their stories have appeared on Google News and appear frequently. And we had 3 stories from Katrina, covering Katrina and aspects of it, that were the #1 story on Google News, and that drives a lot of traffic. The great thing about the website is, well, all media is driven by its reader interests. We all know what stories do well. We all worry about our circulation, and this is what drives our businesses. So we're incredibly consumer focused. That's not to say that we don't also set the pace. We often will choose stories that we think the public need to know about, and not necessarily what's going to get a lot of traffic. But on the website particularly, we are so sensitive to public reaction to what we do. We can see in real time how many people are reading a particular story, how long they are in that story, and where they came from and where they're going. This has shaped our news mix and the choices we make in a way that I've never experienced in more than a quarter of a century news, most of it in newspapers. We now know, from watching this on a daily basis for 5 years, what stories are likely to do best for us and what stories just bomb. I tell you all that because if you pitch, and when you pitch stories to us and we don't always react, it's because we based it on what we know the audience is like. So we monitor the users very carefully. Apart from our stories appearing, we do about 1,000 stories a year on our website. We do also syndicate 3 stories a week through the New York Times syndication service to some 20 other print media around the world. We have a relationship with AOL Research and Learn, and they take a story a week from us, and that gets a vast audience in its own right, but it's our work. I mentioned Google News already, and I told you that the Society's other media frequently will look at us and will follow up. All media watch. You've already heard today, we listen to NPR when we get up. I think we all do that. And we're watching TV news. We're all very, very big media consumers ourselves because we need to know what everybody's doing. And the media, because we're so engaged with what the public are talking about and what's driving news and the water cooler talk, if you like, need to be aware of all that, and so we're all wanting to jump on the same stories. And in our case, whatever the story is of the moment that's big, we're always thinking about what's the National Geographic angle on that. Let me tell you a little bit about the kinds of stories we do. It was mentioned, Jim just talked about how radio stories are put together. It sounded very much like ours in many ways. Our challenge is to get our writers to produce 700 words in a narration or a story that makes sense to people who know nothing about that subject. They will be looking at the headline as lead into that story, and they would first of all need to know the context and the background, and that takes up some space eating into your 700 words, and then you need to keep that story going so that at the end of it people will understand really what that issue was about, what it was, why it was important, and continue to come and read these kinds of stories. So I welcome pitches through the email. Now my email's on this list, and there's some 200 business cards floating around. I think they're out in the front. We would prefer to have stories pitched to us through email to newsroom@nationalgeographic.com or newsroom@ngs.org. That way all 5 editors get to see what the pitches are. We also get hundreds every day, so it's very important that the headline you choose in the email, the subject field, is really what's the headline, what would make us read the email, because if we're intrigued by the headline, then we're very likely to think that our readers would also be intrigued. So that's important, but we would open it anyway. I'm not wild about getting hundreds of phone calls every day. There's no ways I'm going to be answering them. You're welcome to call me. My phone numbers are on that business card, but most likely you're just going to be leaving a voicemail, and I doubt that I'd be able to return hundreds of phone calls. We are all monitoring the email all the time because the editors are glued to their computers. The email's going, it pings. That's the very best way to pitch to us. The story formats that we use, apart from the 700-word stories I told you about, we introduced something this year called Photo in the News, and this could be a good opportunity for you. It's become the most popular thing we do. It's just a great photo, and then we would put in a paragraph or 2 describing what's going on there. We often will get photos from universities or through stories that come through EurekAlert. I picked up one not so long ago about a sunbird in South Africa that is adapted to a particular flower, and the flower has developed this perch particularly for the sunbird with a very long beak. The photo was great. It was visited by many thousands of people, and we could tell that whole research in a paragraph. But really it was the photo that did the reporting for us. So if you have great visuals, please send those. It increases the chances for web use by many degrees. When sending photos to us, it's very important that we have the rights to use them, because we're just going to phone you or email you to get those rights. So you'd save a lot of time and trouble if you pre-clear those rights. And as very often you will see in Science or Nature, they'll tell you for publication with this research and whatever restrictions that are required. But we need to know, and if you don't state it, then we have to follow up, and that might cause the story not to appear. We also have introduced video in the news, and increasingly this is very popular on the internet, so we don't need more than a minute or 3 at the most. Some great video. It could just be a clip of some bizarre animal behavior, B-roll even sometimes. We're looking for that in a major way now, so think about distribution of video. And we're about to introduce interactive maps. maps that are dynamic in some way that the user can click on and will change. It will show, for example, rising sea levels with climate change. So if you have any ideas like that, we've got a great map division. We can build those maps. We would just need the raw input. And next year sometime we hope to introduce a music application. So I don't know if that has any interest to you, but we think that could be pretty big for us. It will be the National Geographic's take on downloading music or playing audio, different cultural music or musical tastes, music tastes from around the world. We obviously, like everybody else, prefer, or it greatly helps us if stories are given to us under embargo. The more time we have to prepare, the better job we can do, the more we can get our ducks in line. Then we are able to publish the story when the embargo lifts. Say it's 1 p.m. on a Thursday, if we knew about that story a few days before. And we had access to all the people, and access was mentioned this morning. That's very important. If you're going to be the conduit to the people that we need to talk to, the primary sources, timeliness, it was already mentioned by Randy here, is so critically important. If you don't have access to the people in your organizations, as has been mentioned, we will find ways around you. We do it all the time. All journalists do that. If we can't get your spokesperson or your experts, we find experts elsewhere to comment. So, just as Randy said, if you know this is coming out, you're going to announce news, you've thought about it, you definitely need to have people available immediately to all the media. They're just going to have to set those days aside because they're obviously going to get a lot of requests for interviews. We do a fairly unusual thing at National Geographic News. We read back our drafts to the people we quote. That's mostly so that we get it correct. So we need those people to be accessible to look at these drafts in good time. They shouldn't. This reading back process cannot hold up the production process. And obviously, like anybody else, if we do make an error, which is not very often, thankfully, we obviously do like to correct it. Generally, being on the web, we just correct it if it's minor. If it was something material that was wrong, for example, the giant catfish that did so well for us, the fish that was caught in Thailand earlier this year, originally the scientists told us it was male, and that one of the photos we showed said it was the fishermen were collecting sperm. The photographer said no, it was female. The fishermen were collecting eggs. The scientist said no, he knows it's definitely male, so we went with his version that it was male. We said it in the caption. Turned out it was female. That wasn't something we could just change, just like that after 3 days. We did change it, but we put a note underneath to say that we originally reported that it was male when it was actually female. So please always approach us if there's something wrong. Don't leave it. It doesn't serve anybody any good to keep wrong information out there. We certainly don't want to do that. Half of our traffic comes from people visiting the database of stories. We have 4,000 stories out there now, and I'm frequently seeing stories that are 2-3 years old, among the most popular stories of the week. So it's very important that stories are correct because people are using them for reference. I could tell you a little bit about some more of our plans. We do the news site, but we're about to unveil other types of content on our site, more standalone features, evergreen features, the music application I told you about. These will be interactive features like our Forces of Nature feature, which explain how hurricanes, tornadoes, tsunamis work. And we've integrated our film library, the National Geographic's film library, 25,000 hours of video with what we do on the website. And we hope to bring a lot more video to everything we do on the site. Let me finish by just saying you're in Washington, and anytime you're in Washington, please visit us at National Geographic. I'd be happy to meet with you. We have a great free museum there. That's a little promo for us. We have a terrific exhibit on Napoleon right now, some of his personal effects, including his famous hat and some of his clothing. And I'd be happy to show you around and introduce you to people. And please email us. We're happy to engage with you. Thank you very much.
David Braun, thank you very much. We have a personal invitation. He's going to come meet with us. Now, who's interested in contacting David Braun? Aha. And I suppose the audience of 250 million doesn't hurt either, does it? Okay, all right. Last but not least, Rick Weiss is with us. He's the science and medical reporter from the Washington Post. I know that as you come forward, Rick, for me oftentimes I like to see the other journalists because, I'm often reading their work, and certainly when you're working in local news, you may be following the Washington Post. So you want to know who is that person just in case you run into them at a news conference so that you can kind of pick their brain on what they're working on so that you don't have to follow it the next day. So I am thrilled to lay eyes on Rick Weiss. Please welcome him.
Thank you. So I write about science and medicine at a large daily newspaper, and I guess the first truth that comes out of this that needs to be addressed is that although science obviously is of great importance, perhaps the most important thing to all of you, science obviously is of great importance, perhaps the most important thing to all of you and all of us, it's of relatively passing and minor importance to most of the editors at the Washington Post who care modestly about it and know a little bit less than that. So that's the first hurdle that we always have to deal with, not just you, but me as well. Back in the days when Ben Bradley was executive editor at the Post during the days of Watergate, my beat was part of a larger beat that was known in those days as SMERSH. SMERSH stood for, I believe if I've got this right, Science, Medicine, Education, and Related Shit. It was not highly valued. Things are better today, but, this is still not a science newspaper. If you need more recent evidence of that, just in the last couple of years, the Science Pod at the Post, as we call ourselves, about 8 of us on the national desk, had a pretty nice piece of real estate in the newsroom with a fair amount of elbow room. We all got moved a couple of years ago to a sort of slum elsewhere in the room so that the continuous news department, the newly created continuous news department, could take over our bit of real estate. These are the people who funnel the news that we're writing over to the website for the Washington Post. So that gives you a little bit of the Kremlinology of sort of who's in and who's out. Science continues to struggle to buy space and attention in the newspaper. Now, of course, science has an additional disadvantage, which is that something actually has to have happened. Something has to have been shown to have been true or probably true. The mere fact that somebody got up and said something is not news on our beat, whereas much of the rest of the paper, that is the case. If someone up on Capitol Hill gets up and says something, it's news. And it kills us every day in the Science Pod to watch, precious space in the newspaper taken up with stories because somebody simply said something, which may or may not be true, often was not. We are held to this ridiculous standard of, scientific evidence and, controls and all this kind of stuff. And unless it's there, we can't even mention it. It's rough. Now, that said, I don't want to leave the impression that the criteria for getting a science story into the paper is all that objective, as all of you and us really know in our hearts. Don Colburn, who used to write about health at the Washington Post and now is out at the Oregonian, I believe this is his line originally. He used to say that the definition of news is that it's something that happened to your editor, or that your editor at least knows about. So, if your editor had a baby, we need a lot of stories about, early childhood development, that kind of thing. That's news. This is a very quirky process, let's face it. And, it's great. You're getting a lot of advice from a handful of us up here. We're all very different in sort of what appeals to us and what's going to work. It's great that you're getting a variety of ideas. Personally, I gag on email sandwiches. I'm not, don't send me an email sandwich, please. I can't stand them. I don't like guilt, and I don't respond well to it. So, one thing I sometimes get into that I'd like to spend just a few minutes talking about that might help put your job in perspective is my take on a brief history of science writing, so you can sort of see where you fit into the history of the way I see what my job is. Science writing decades ago, maybe in the 50s and 60s, certainly through the space program and so on, the early space program, this was basically, the job of a science writer was basically the job of a science booster. Everything was great, everything was cool. Every day there was a new story about, isn't this a neat invention, isn't this great progress? And I think these were the good old days for you folks and for us. Anything that you had to pitch to us was just the neatest thing since sliced bread. And any chance we had to write about it was fun and great. Those were fine and innocent days. Then things began to change. I think one of the biggest influences that made this change was the infiltration of more and more money into science and the linkage between business and science, partly just because of the way capitalism has evolved, co-evolved with science in this country, partly things like the Bayh-Dole Act that really worked to bring the profit motive into academic science more and more. And so my job as a reporter became more of one of not only having to understand the science and pitch the science and be excited about the science, but also understand what the ulterior motives might be here and bring a little bit more of a skeptical eye to what I was doing, and to understand a little bit more of the sort of tools that the business reporter brings to his or her trade. Things went from there into an even more sort of spooky realm, which was where politics and ethics got more and more involved in science. This is partly, I think, the result of the kind of science that's been going on, at least in the biological sciences in the last few years, as we're all aware. Things like stem cell science, embryonic research on embryonic cells of various kinds have raised very interesting political and ethical questions. It's forced science writers to deal with, to first of all learn about new areas of knowledge, to study a little bit of philosophy and history of ethics and things like that. It has its up and down sides. I think it certainly makes stories more interesting because they're more complex in terms of the mix of ideas that might come into play. And as Art Kaplan once told me, to play off of something he once told me, he once said that reproductive scientists, or scientists who work in the assisted reproductive technology field, amounted to the Full Employment Act for ethicists. And I think in the same way, you know, the way that science has been going these days is sort of the Full Employment Act for science writing. There's just, there is a growing appetite for stories that sort of deal with the yuck factor that scientists is rubbing up against. At the same time, it makes life more difficult because much of my stories today are taken up having to explain the business, political, and ethical implications of what's happened, and there seems to be less and less room to talk about the science itself, which is sort of why I got into this in the first place. This problem is exacerbated, has been exacerbated in the last few years as the trends in the newspaper industry have shown that there may be not a huge appetite for science stories, at least among editors and maybe among the public. There seems to be, you know, circulation is down. I think you don't have to be told that there's a lot of concern in the print news area, at least, that things are not going very well economically. Circulation has dropped fairly significantly at most of the major dailies. There's a lot of sort of gnashing of teeth about what we ought to do to get readers back and to keep their attention. And one of the big answers these days, correct or not, and strategies that are being implemented is to shrink the size of stories, to have less room actually to talk about what's going on. And when you have a story that has not only science but business, political, and ethical implications, and you've got a smaller space than ever to write it, it gets, you know, pretty hard to get an idea across to the readers about what really happened yesterday. Now, on top of that, there's this responsibility that science writers have that I often complain about. Some of you perhaps have heard me rant about this before. That we, for some reason, have this obligation to explain, you know, every step of how what was discovered got discovered, or, you know, what the terms are that we're talking about. This is an obligation that, you know, on its face seems fair enough. You don't want to just write something that no one can understand. At the same time, I find it fairly, or have found it fairly frustrating, because it's a responsibility that many of my colleagues at the newspaper don't have to deal with. And it's always easy to come up with examples. So whenever I get into this, I just did this morning. I go into the business section and the sports section. There's always plenty of fodder to work with there. So, for example, business story from this morning. This is a company called Refco. Refco's larger business, its futures trading operations, well, if you don't know what futures trading is, that sounds weird, is regulated by the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, as well as public exchanges that engage in futures trading, such as the Chicago Mercantile Exchange. How Refco's problems would affect the broader futures and derivatives trading markets was difficult to determine. Well, it will be difficult to determine because I have no idea what those markets are or what they do and what they care about, and there's no, effort at all to educate me about what any of these things mean, and apparently no responsibility to do so. Sports pages today, talking about some guy named Edmonds, I believe. Maybe you know him. He did it in the fifth. The fifth what? Catching Edmonds looking at a breaking pitch at his knees, disposing of a first and second jam. Sounds like a sandwich. Maybe it's an email sandwich with jam. And he did it again in the seventh. The seventh what? Inducing a swing from Edmonds on the first pitch with men on first and second. First and second what? Okay, maybe you know about baseball a little bit. Maybe you don't. But there's, these widespread assumptions all the time in business and sports that if you don't understand this stuff already, you're not going to turn to that section. But for science, we're supposed to be writing for everybody, whether they really care about science or not. Now, I used to actually complain about this more, but I have to say I've added a new sort of addendum to my classic complaint here, because lately I've been realizing, as I think many of you have from stories about evolution or other topics, that there is this horrific ignorance in this country about what science is and how science works and just what it means to even think rationally and logically. So I'm slowly coming around to the grudging conclusion here that maybe it is my responsibility to teach as well as to tell the news, and I'm complaining a little bit less about the expectation that I spell all this stuff out, and realizing that if I don't do it, I don't know who else is. And so this leads me to the last few points I'd like to make, which gets back to you. What am I looking for from you, and how can you help in this process of my reporting the news, and perhaps more and more on the side educating the public about how to think scientifically and rationally. The first thing, of course, is the bottom line requirement that whatever you're going to pitch to me, it has to be news. It has to fit the global definition of news. Something actually had to have happened, and it can't just be that somebody said something. Publication is in a scientific journal is obviously one of the easy, if somewhat artificial, pegs that will get you over that hurdle. And I would encourage you to pay attention to the scientists in your areas who are publishing not only in the big famous journals of science and Nature and New England Journal and so on, which, believe me, we get plenty of material from every week, a week in advance. I know every story that's coming out in these journals every week, and you don't have to tell me about them. But I don't always see the stuff that's coming out in the smaller journals. They often don't have staffs to inform us. They're often very good and interesting papers. They're often quirky papers. And many of them don't have embargo systems in place, which means they offer me an opportunity to be first in something, which of course is the big hang-up that all newspaper people have. We want to be first. And I can never be first with a story in Nature, Science, or any of these other publications where I'm constrained to writing my story or having my story run the same day as the New York Times and every other paper is going to run. So I would keep in mind that there are a lot of other places where your scientists and experts are publishing that a lot of people don't know about, and I'd love to be the first one to hear about it. Things that help. Graphics are becoming more and more important. I mentioned to you earlier that editors want shorter stories, but one thing they also want is more art. There's a feeling that people will be more interested in stories and understand things better if there are photographs, better design pages, and graphics there. We have a wonderful staff of graphics people at the Post who do a lot of stuff from scratch and also can redraw things that you folks have already put out. We don't usually run things directly sent to us, but it's great fodder to work with that we can adapt and redesign. So if you have explanatory graphics that do a good job of explaining something complicated, that's wonderful. Photos are great. I'm working on a story now for the Monday Science page that just as an afterthought, the scientist sent me, said, hey, by the way, we have this photo we took that, maybe will help. And it's admittedly, it's ridiculously cute, but it's a little mouse in a beaker that, whose fur pattern happens to show something of relevance to the scientific work that was done. And, you show this picture around and everyone just sort of breaks down and says, oh, it's so cute, we got to run the photo. It's going to make the page look good, except for the few people who will call in about us torturing mice in beakers. And that can help. And of course, the even more sickening approach, but I have to admit it works sometimes, is, although I try not to respond to it, but sometimes it's irresistible. It seems like scientists more and more are giving their, the animals they create or the other things they do these cute names. This, to my mind, started in a big way a few years ago when scientists created a mouse with an extra copy of a gene that seemed to make it learn faster and named it the Doogie mouse after Doogie Howser, this young precocious MD. And this has caught on in a lot of ways. Cloned animals, for some reason, especially have, cute or clever names to them. I don't know what to tell you about it, but sometimes it works. So, maybe for these guys it'll turn them off completely, but my editors fall for this stuff all the time. I mentioned I don't really like email sandwiches. I don't know why it is that I have to get a phone call first to tell me you're going to send me an email, and then you send me an email, often 2 or 3 all in a row for some reason. I don't know if people have, Parkinson's problems on the keyboard or what, but once is enough. You don't have to do it all in caps. I think there's a real problem with a growing number of, all caps subject lines, which sort of makes me nervous. So, and then the phone call later, of course, did you get my email? I don't know. I just like an email, and I really try very hard to read pretty much everything I get, and hopefully that's enough. One thing you should certainly not do is send me mail, regular mail. The Washington Post, after the anthrax attacks in 2001, had to institute a complicated system that is still in place just in case. We used to be able to go, our mail was sorted by slots with our names on them in this area just off the newsroom, and we'd go there every day or so and grab our pile of mail and bring it to our desk, and while you're listening to messages and doing this and that, you open your mail and see what you've got. It wasn't a bad way to get news across from us, and even if it wasn't the most instantaneous system, at least I knew within a day or two of interesting ideas that were going on. After the anthrax attacks, the editors realized that, if we open an envelope in the newsroom and there's anthrax powder in there, we're going to have to, evacuate the newsroom. We're not going to get in for weeks. We don't have an extra newsroom anywhere to run to, which the Times actually does up in New Jersey. So that would be a great disadvantage in the competitive world of newspapering. And there's only so much room in the, Prince George's Bureau and so on for us all to squeeze into. So they created a brand new room on a different floor of the building that is an amazing place to see. And the few times that I entertain guests at the Post, and let me just tell you up front that when you call to say, I'm going to be in town and can I just come by and drop some stuff, I'm afraid my policy is no, unless it's a topic that I'm really writing, this week, because otherwise I spend all my time entertaining and it would be fun, but I wouldn't get anything done. But the few times when I do have people over, I always show them this because it's the coolest part of the Post now. It's like a science lab. There's this room with these it's a negative pressure room. So you walk in here through a double set of doors. There's these big, sucking blowers going all the time that are pulling air out. So if anyone and all your mail has to be brought into there to open your mail. So if you open an envelope and some anthrax powder comes out, it will not blow through the doors towards the newsroom. It'll get sucked out through these special HEPA filters and all kinds of special stuff and just hit 15th Street for better or worse. Right. It's a lot safer in the building than out these days. That's a little tip for all of you. And there's a special hood down there with UV lights and things, and if you have a suspicious envelope, I don't know, one with stains or wires hanging out, I think are the classic definitions. You open it under the hood, and you get to pretend you're a scientist and put gloves on and masks and all this kind of stuff. It's all there, so it's kind of fun. But the bottom line is we all go to the mailroom now, I don't know, twice a month. It's just not worth it. It's a lot of trouble to open mail. We don't bother doing it much anymore. The last thing I wanted to mention is there's always, I think sometimes people don't remember that there are many sections to the paper that can write and run science stories. The science desk at the Washington Post is part of the national news section, and most of the science news ends up in the national section. But there's no reason why science can't end up in other parts of the paper. In particular, the financial section is often relevant and can give stories fine play. You can play us a little bit this way, for better or worse, and I'll tell you just one anecdote to close of how this sometimes shakes out that also relates back to the issue I mentioned earlier of science by press release, which I really don't like when no one has really proven anything other than saying something. This happened, I don't know, a couple of years ago now, when there was a journal article being published. I think it was going to be in Science, so it was embargoed for a Friday. And it was about some scientists who had knocked out a gene in pigs, one of two genes that seems to be would be responsible for the human immune system rejecting a pig organ if one were to be implanted into your body. And scientists want to knock these genes out in pigs so the organs in these pigs could be used as transplant organs into people. So partial success. One of these two genes was knocked out. You got pigs that are almost transplantable organs. It was going to be a good news story. We got this a week in advance, as we typically do for big journals. I prepared the story. It was going to run Friday. And then we got a press release on Wednesday, I think, from a competing company that had succeeded in the same thing, but hadn't had time to get it to a journal yet because they were second in succeeding. But they knew that their competitors were going to get news on Friday, and they didn't want to be beat that way. In fact, they were pretty open about the fact that they were short on money and needed some publicity. They put out a press release saying, "We've done this too, and you can put this in Thursday's paper." So we had sort of an ethical dilemma on the science desk. What do you do? I mean, the right thing to do is to wait until Friday, because these guys were really first, and they're publishing in a journal to boot, so it's been peer-reviewed. And in that story, mention, probably further down that, yesterday or Wednesday, this other group claimed they had done the same thing, and maybe they did. But there are competitive issues that come into play. What if the Times, for example, I don't mean to keep mentioning them, but they do sort of, they've got about 4 times as many science writers as us and a lot of other advantages, and, we do think about them now and then. And, what if they run the story on Thursday about these other guys, and it's going to seem like we missed the story, and then we're going to be sort of seen as scrambling to catch up on Friday by mentioning both of them, and that would be embarrassing. So we sort of went back and forth on this and finally decided to do the right thing, and we just waited and kind of held our breath. So Thursday morning comes around, I go out to the front sidewalk, pick up my Times, and leaf through it, and it's not in there, which is great. They made the same decision that we did. Sit down for my cup of coffee, open up the Post, and turn to the business section, and there's this big story about these Thursday guys on the front of the business section with a photo of these pigs and everything. We hadn't thought to talk to the business section folks and to warn them away from this, and they didn't even know about the journal thing that was coming out on Friday. So, you do have the opportunity to play us, for better or worse. We are trying to improve our communication among the people who cover science and other desks, but keep in mind that there are many venues for your stories that way. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Isn't this a phenomenal panel? Great information from all these people. Now, I realize we're running a little close on time, but we do still have some time for Q&A. And I must say, as a courtesy to the people who are sitting on this side of the room, who sometimes can't see all the people on the panel, if we have a couple of microphones, wireless microphones, that we're working throughout the audience, if we could have one start on this side so that these people at least get...
Thank you. I'm Harvey Lyford from the American Geophysical Union. And the question, it's not really a question, it's a lament to Rick and also Dr. Healy. Rick, you mentioned the shrinking science news hole and the shrinking news hole altogether, and you just seem to sort of shrug, that's the way it is. I'd like to know what we can do about it, how we might be able to educate the editors who, as you say, are uninterested. Dr. Healy, I think it's great that U.S. News has hired you And we who do not deal in health always envy those who do because it's easy to get in. But the rest of U.S. News' science department has essentially evaporated. So what can we do, all of us together?
One thing you can do is write letters to the top editors and the ombudsman at the Post, expressing that lament, and especially if there are particular examples where you think important stories are going by that are either not getting covered or getting covered too briefly. They do look at this stuff. Another thing, something that happened several years ago when the Human Genome Project was still going on, Francis Collins at the Genome Institute, who's a very good explainer of science and a very sort of ebullient salesman of science, really, invited the top editors at the Post to come out to NIH for a couple of hours and get basically a dog and pony show about genetics. And to my surprise, they accepted. Len Downey, the executive editor, and the managing editor at the time, and a few other mid-level assignment editors went out there. And he did a spectacular show with a couple of other scientists and actually got them very jazzed up. And they walked out of there with me saying, we got to get more stories about genetics in the paper. This is really great. Now, I don't think that's going to happen often, but if you've got, somebody who is really good and can somehow make contact with some of these top people and get their juices going, they're not totally immune to this, but they are mostly just overwhelmed with the stuff that is more traditionally the work of a national newspaper, especially one based in Washington. They're very hung up on politics and on national and international affairs, and you got to work hard to sort of shake them and get their attention. I don't know if that's much of an answer, but that's a start.
I completely agree with what Rick said, and I was also intrigued by your comments, Rick, because I thought U.S. News and World Report was the only news organization that decided that science wasn't going to have its own section. And I must say the National Geographic benefited because one of our most terrific science editors, Tim Appenzeller, who actually has a cover story in National Geographic this current issue, was recruited by National Geographic. I somehow I really do envy National Geographic because it does really so beautifully cover science. But I think that I always think you have to, my philosophy of life is, affirm, don't deny. This has happened. It seems to be a phenomenon. But I think alternatively, the editors will tell you they're going to cover science, but they're going to embed it in the culture section, the business section, the medical section. So I think that a strategy is really, it forces PIOs to say, well, science has got to be integrated into the society as a whole. And you have to ask yourself, whatever it is, how it can touch the reader, that person. Imagine you're the person, imagine you're the patient, imagine you're the reader. And I personally believe that there is almost no pursuit of science, however fundamental, that cannot and should not be translated into something that has an impact on people. And so it's a slight torque in the, you have to work a little harder in terms of, whether it's nanotechnology, whether it's plate tectonics, whether it's genetics, whether it's nematodes, ecology. Science is in the fabric of our society, whether we know it or not. What it has lost, and I think that Rick again pointed to, what's lost is its crown of glory as this freestanding, wonderful ivory tower establishment that people bow down to. That's reality. What has saved medicine, if you think about the science, and I often have joked with my colleagues at the National Science Foundation, is that the difference, the National Science Foundation usually has even though it covers the whole breadth of science, just look at it. When I was at NIH, the National Science Foundation's budget was about $2 billion, and ours was, 12 billion. And I used to occasionally feel guilty. Irish guilt is not a good thing, but I realized, and I would concede, that the difference was that NIH was doing phenomenal basic and applied science, but on behalf of human health, whereas the National Science Foundation mission was science almost for science sake, which is noble and right, but it is a methodology the public doesn't doesn't understand. So you don't change anything. If anything, this ennobles science, getting it out. And quite honestly, medicine has taken a lot of heat. It's gotten, I remember in my early career, you never saw any medical stories on the front page. You never saw medical covered. It was just like the rest of science. And also, you called a scientist. I know when I was at Hopkins and early at NIH, the attitude when the press called was no comment. The scientists would commune only with each other and God, and only God occasionally. The notion, it was kind of a tacky thing to do, to talk to reporters, to those how dare they, they don't understand what I'm doing. Now that has had a radical shift, but I think that the medical field really led it, because the medical field is so connected, almost to the point that my emails are overwhelmed with scientists who send emails, and I think I agree with that. On the emails, they get they get hard. So I think what we have to do is just change the approach and recognize science embedded in all of the other endeavors of society, which in the long run I think will be good in terms of selling science. And Francis does do that very well. The genome, the Drosophila genome has great impact. But if you just talk about Drosophila, no one's going to listen.
Unless maybe it's on Canadian Broadcasting Corporation.
I think there's something interesting to talk here in terms of the responsibility that we as science journalists have, because the science page in the science program is ghetto and turf, and those are both issues, right? When you've got a science section, you've got a guaranteed place to place your story. That might not mean that you're actually fighting as hard to find a place on the front page for a really important story. We have the issue at the CBC where I've worked with senior producers who get angry when other programs cover science, because that's what we do. Well, they're news programs, they're current affairs programs, and of course they should be doing this stuff. So our responsibility is actually help them with that, and we make that effort a lot of times. But yeah, it's something journalists, I think, could work on a little bit. Well, science journalists could certainly work on our responsibility to sort of explain the basics as part of that, I think.
I think this is shooting myself in the foot a bit, but the notion of a news hole is going to change. We're in a transitional period where news providing organizations are realigning themselves, and in 10 to 15 years you're not going to recognize the way that information gets out. It may be true that in print media there's less there, but for goodness sakes, when you sit down and you want to know about something in an unprecedented fashion, you can find out now about that something very quickly in a lot of new ways. So it may be that we all change and all have to realign ourselves with the new media that are coming up in the next 10 to 15 years.
Mm-hmm. And I would suggest that it's quite possible that new media may mean that you are developing your own blogs and your own information and not even going through the standard operating procedures. It's just something to think about that's definitely coming. I think we have a question right here, this gentleman. We'll bring a microphone to you, sir, if you would let us know your name and affiliation and direct your question, please.
Hi, I'm Jim Swires, University of Pittsburgh News Bureau. I wanted to ask the panel how much they use the websites from various organizations as a way to find leads for stories. I came from genome.gov. I was there just a couple of months ago. They get it. Francis Collin gets it. He understands how to use the web. I'm now at the University of Pittsburgh where there's a disconnect between the News Bureau and the website. They don't quite understand how to use the website to push information out to them. I was wondering if that is a major source of ideas for.
Yes.
Yeah, I use that kind of websites, especially at academic institutions, a lot. But it's primarily to reach people, to contact people. If I've got, let's say I'm working on a story and I think there's somebody at Pittsburgh, one of your researchers or a professor who knows something about the topic, I go to your website and I try to find him. If I can't find him or her, I want the number for your news office, and I'll call your news office to try to put me in touch with him. It amazes me the number of academic institutions that have a beautiful website that doesn't mention that they have a news office and doesn't include a phone number. Those things are vital. A lot of them say contact us, and you click on contact us, and it wants you to send an email.
We do that, but it's at the bottom of the page. You can't find it. It's security through obscurity.
Yeah. But put somewhere on the page, right up on top, something that says like news, and where your news releases are, where your newsroom contact is, what you guys have been active at recently. That is very helpful to us.
We
use the web for fact-checking, and most of the institutions that send us the original research have great websites, but I couldn't agree more. It's astonishing how difficult it can be to find the press office. You could spend 10, 15 minutes in absolute frustration digging through a university's website. We make it a policy when we report on a science story to always link back to that institution's page, and I feel very sorry for the readers sometimes, because it just goes to that university there. If we could find the original press release or something on that research or that scientist that we quote, some universities or institutions have great profiles of the people we quote, and then we link directly to that person's page. If the institution has its own report and pictures and additional information, we like to link to that, because our readers have got 700 words. It's a great hook. I know we track these links. They're very popular to go back to get more information. And so many times we just link to the homepage of the institution because they've got nothing else. And it's for the reader to find out that it's a dead end. I would definitely do something about your home websites for both finding press information, press contacts, and think of the readers who are coming through the web to find more information.
Thus, help us, help you, help them, help each other. Yes, okay. I know we have a question over here.
My name is Kimberly Weiss with the American Gastroenterological Association, and my question is, to find a story that is relevant to your organization is such a great joy, especially when you're not expecting it. But it's kind of a horrible feeling when a lot of the information that is included in the story might not be factually correct or might be exaggerating of sorts. What is your best advice on getting in touch with the writer, issuing kind of like a correction letter to the editor, but going a step further and maybe even getting it published?
Are you directing that to a specific journalist?
I guess Rick or anyone.
Yeah, get the local guy.
It wasn't in the post.
I've never run into that situation.
Thank you.
Newspapers generally, and the Post in particular, have been recently hardening up the procedures through which corrections are handled, because I think we've all recognized that it's been a little bit sloppy for a long time. And it used to be, well, if you had a problem with my story, you could call me or email me, and hopefully I would do the right thing and pass it along to an editor and get a correction in, and sometimes it would happen and sometimes it wouldn't. And it's a bad system because we all are disincented to have corrections running on things we've written. So the Post now, and I think most major papers, has a email system that's quite standardized, and it's in the paper and on the website every day. I think the address is corrections@washpost.com. And anything that gets sent in from anybody that claims that there's been a mistake gets vetted through a formalized process. It gets CC'd to the writer and to the editor who handled the story. It has to be dealt with within a certain amount of time, and someone makes a rabbinical decision in the end about whether it needs to be addressed as a correction, a clarification, or whether it's not actually wrong. So it's a pretty cut and dried system right now that I think is much less prone to the sort of subjective vicissitudes that it used to be subject to.
Now, Randy, is the system the same with AP?
Well, it's not quite the same, but what we do, we have an approach. Our idea is to get the news first, but first get it right. If there's an error in a story, we want to know right away for a variety of reasons. There's not a question of you don't like the way we wrote it, we don't like the approach we took. But if you're talking about a factual error, our stories go into a file, electronic file, and they're reused over and over again. And if we want to write another story on the same topic, we go back and look at that older story. And we don't want to perpetuate an error. If there's a factual error in one of our stories, we want to fix it now for a couple of reasons. One is we need to get the error off the wire and get it not in newspapers, not on broadcasters. Secondly, if I hear about an error that the story is still alive, which means the live story is still that day, I can write it right through to the story and fix it. If I don't hear about it till the next day, I got to write a correction. And if I got to write a correction, I got to write a letter to New York explaining how this horrible stupidity could have occurred. So that's why I want to fix it, and I want to fix it fast.
Question here. Well, maybe for the rest of the audience members.
Jennifer Chair, NYU Medical Center. I have a question for Rick Weiss and any editors and writers as well. A lot of us at academic institutions pride ourselves in trying our best to develop good relationships with reporters and editors. And you were talking about sort of going into different sections, sort of cheating, if you will, and if you don't like it, maybe we can go to someone else. If we would like to maintain a good relationship with a writer, but we think that writer is not interested in our story and we want to go to possibly another writer, if we're very close with that writer, we can just speak frankly with them, but if we're not that close, we don't want to burn bridges. So how can we do that without being very rude?
I think that's pretty simple, and if people do it more and more. You can send me something, and if you know another writer on another desk who covers, this topic from the financial side or something, you can say, I'm also sending this message to so-and-so, just so that we know, and we don't find ourselves both working on a story, the same story. If you don't know who the alternative person is, but you either on the basis of evidence or just, fear that I'm not going to have time or interest in doing it, you can ask, if this is not of interest to you or it's not going to clear the bar per national, is there anyone you'd recommend elsewhere in the paper? Including, sometimes something like the style section. I mean, sometimes some of the best science stories get done as features in style because there's an interesting scientist or character, or there's just some weird twist. The style section, just this past week, we were talking about avian flu, I guess, and they were saying, well, aren't there some stories about the flu that style ought to have? And I said, well, the latest, I shouldn't give this away because I haven't written it yet, but I said, some of the latest National Preparedness Plan has a really interesting section on corpse management. I think we could do a style story about corpse management. What do you do when there's thousands of bodies lying around? Katrina gave us a hint of how disturbing that can be. It would be much worse than that. So, there are a lot of different ways of getting at a story. If you have a corpse management specialist at NYU or something, maybe it's not a science story. Maybe it's a style story. But just ask who would be good.
I actually wanted to ask Randy Schmid as well, just because, with something like the style section, it's assuming that you have some time, but if you have something that is sort of breaking news or whatever, it has to come out right away. If you think that the Associated Press reporter that you're working with is not interested, how do you?
Normally, we don't like to have you approach 3 or 4 of us all at the same time. It causes confusion. But if you've got enough story that you want to pitch to me, that's fine. If I think I'm not interested, but I think somebody else in the AP might be, I'll tell you that and give you their phone number or email. If I don't do that, ask me. Do I think there's somebody else that might be interested? And quite often I'll refer you to someone else. It doesn't hurt to ask.
I just want to add something. Just yesterday we were in contact with a scientist, and he happened to mention that he was also talking to our magazine about the same story. So if different parts of our organization contact you, as a courtesy, just to alert us to that, the worst thing that we could do is scoop our own magazine. They have a very long lead time. They'd be very upset if we stumbled on the same story, and if we could avoid it. So it's good, I think, to tell the organization, by the way, I'm also talking to this person.
Okay, I know that we have a question back here, and I'm sorry, Kathy, because this means a lot of legwork for you. However, I think the real key here is just about with everything that has to do with media is know the outlet that you're working with and how they operate, because obviously some people do want to know whether or not you're talking to other folks, and other people don't necessarily mind quite as much as long as they're not scooped, right? Yes.
Clev Messador with National Minority Health Month Foundation. It's a very simplistic question, and it has 2 parts. One is going back to, I think, what Rick was saying about graphics and photos in terms of providing them for reporters when you email them. But every email system has a spam filter. Mine automatically deletes all graphics, and a lot of reporters, if there's a graphic, the email gets put into spam and you'll never see it. So how do you break through in terms of if you do have compelling photos or graphics and you want to share them? Is it that separate email then you think, hey, we're somehow just hitting send multiple times? And the second part question is, I think you mentioned it in terms of the evolution of news with information sharing, with webcasting and streaming and iPad video and so many different ways to get your news. You're right, press people do have to find different ways to reach people who disseminate information, but it's in terms of going beyond those traditional tactics. Do you have any thoughts in terms of how you see press people eventually communicating with people who do disseminate information?
Any volunteers on the first part of that question?
We deal with this problem all the time. Our people send us big attachments and the spam filter strips them off, throws it straight into the trash. In fact, the whole email gets thrown into the trash, so we don't know that we received it in the first place. There are ways around it, or never send an attachment, because any organization tells you not to open an attachment in the first place because of viruses. Send an email and say they're great images or we have a graphic available. Either host that on your own website where we can look at it, or if we know who you are and we trust you, we can tell you how to FTP it to our site so that you avoid that problem. But there are ways to do it.
Yes.
On the second one, well, a lot of places are doing the things I'm going to suggest, but basically create your own really great website that talks about all the great news you guys are doing. Multimedia, make it right up to date with all the nice bells and whistles. Make sure that it becomes a really prime site for science and health news. Make sure that links to it, that you get links put on a lot of other prominent websites of the same kind. And do your homework. Keep it up, because things really change a lot. Once you've committed to doing that, you're committing to always doing that. It's sort of Tristram Shandy in his own autobiography. The more that I write, the more that I have to write, because I have to write about why I'm writing. But a lot of the best places, like Harvard Medical School, has a great website, and people like me go to it. We want to know what's going on. And the savvier places are doing that. So rather than sitting around waiting for the web to come to you, you go to the web.
Yes. Lady in the green.
I'm Catherine Servino from the New York Academy of Medicine, and I just had a few questions about practicalities of distributing releases and getting your attention with them. It's a few parts, but it's all in the same vein. One is, although EureKAlert is a co-sponsor here today, I'd appreciate honesty. Like, how much do you troll EureKAlert for press releases, specifically about new journal publications coming out, versus responding to press releases that we send out as PIOs via email, typically? Emails versus phone calls, just personal preferences, especially for daily news operations, Randy and Rick. And your feeling towards mass distribution lists, which is what my organization historically had done a lot of, which is, mass blast to lists in different parts of the country or different types of media outlets in BCC lines. If you're clued into that's the way it's being distributed, is it automatically a delete? So that's pretty much it.
I read EureKAlert every day, sometimes twice a day, because new stuff pops up and other stuff goes off. If you send out emails, I look at them. We don't have a problem with it stripping out art. It comes through to me, so I can give it to our photo desk. I'm looking for particular things. If you have an article in a journal that I cover, I'll open it up and see what you have to say. If it's in a journal that I don't cover, if you send it to a bunch of AP people, you may send it to one of the others who covers that journal. If you're not sure, call me up and I'll tell you who covers which journal. That's easy to do. For me, it's PNAS, Science, and Nature Medicine. But Malcolm Ritter in our New York office covers a bunch of journals. But if you put it on EurekAlert, I'll see it, and most AP science writers will all see it.
EurekAlert is definitely something we look at. There's a bunch of sites, and they sort of appear and disappear, but they're essentially the digesters for this stuff. I typically tell people not to put me on distribution lists. Just get too much stuff, and even if I get 2 bad emails, you're in my kill file. There's just way too much. So what I'll say is, if I give out my email addresses, if you think something is going to be particularly interesting to me, send it to me. Otherwise, I don't want to be on your distribution list. Trying to go through levels of spam. The real spam, the almost real spam, and just the press releases that I really don't care about is troublesome enough. Trying to find what I really want to read.
I personally don't look at EurekAlert every day, although it's a great site, but the only reason I get away with that is because there are other people who do it, and we have a science editor who's constantly scanning that, and a couple of other people are just sort of EurekAlert addicts, so I've learned that I don't have to be on it every day. Someone will no doubt be pointing out things to me, but it's clearly an important place to put stuff if you want to get noticed. I personally prefer emails to calls. Calls are more interruptive when I'm trying to write or do something else, and it's nice to have a little bit of, although I'm refreshing my email about every 90 seconds or so all day, that's a little more freedom than the phone just, ringing in my face instantaneously. I don't have to respond right away if I'm trying to think of something. And as far as the blasts go, it is amazing how much stuff comes in that has absolutely no hope of ever getting into the paper. And I don't know what people are thinking and why you bother unless you're getting paid per email that you send. I really don't. I mean, it's great. I'm sure you're all very proud of, everything that's happened, and it's important to the institution, and it's great, very helpful to society in the long run, I'm sure. But it isn't news. You got a grant from NIH. Good on you. It's not news. NIH maintains a database, the CRISP database. Tells everyone who got a grant. You're in there already. If I want to know who's got a grant, I'll go there. I wish the bar were higher somehow for folks sending stuff out from institutions, so that there was at least a pretty high chance that anything that comes into my email basket is something worth at least considering, because there is this desensitization process that goes on over time, and most of us are attentive enough that it's a fairly specific desensitization process, and we recognize institutions in our email queues that just aren't worth checking, and that's too bad for you, for that 1 out of 20 or 50 that really you want us to see.
Okay, gentleman in the blue, yes.
I'm David Aguilar, Harvard-Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics. 2 quick questions. Where does Congress get its news? And secondly, how many stories are picked by the journalists, by the editors, or the art department?
Good questions.
I can't speak for Congress, but I think they read the internet and listen to their staffs. How many stories are picked by journalists or editors? In the AP's case, the stories are decided on pretty much by the reporters, although my editor at least is interested in science, and she reads EurekAlert, and she'll come by and ask about things and suggest things. But I can dissuade her. Our art people don't make decisions on stories, but when they know what stories we're working on, they always show up with a glint in their eye saying, we need art to go with it.
Yeah, John.
My impression at the Inquirer, at least, is that the way it works is that reporters find out something's going on and they advocate to the editors, who in turn advocate to our front page and A section and B section meetings every day. And so it is of greater use to you to advocate directly to a writer than to an editor. I think that's the rubber meets the road answer. So if you have a target writer, advocate directly to that person. Not that he or she is going to like it, Rick, but that's better. That's more useful directly for you than to the editor, because editors tend not to know anything unless someone else tells them that thing, and then they can edit it. So But I see people advocating directly to editors, and it's an awkward process because they don't know what to do with it. They usually give it to a reporter and say, check this out. So you see what happens. You've sort of gone the wrong part of the loop. Anyway.
And Congress gets its news from Rick.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think... never mind. Anyway, I think one exception to the editor versus reporter rule, I agree that most of the stories at the Post bubble up from the bottom. We're the ones who are paying attention to stuff most closely and get interested in things. But, less hard news stories or less deadline stories and more trend stories, those kinds of stories I think editors are more amenable to. The science editor at the Post is often meeting with people. He's nicer than I am. And people come in and sort of, just sort of tweak his interest in a topic. And they say, you don't have to do this tomorrow. This is not breaking news. But this is a pretty hot area and it's really interesting. Why don't you see if you can get one of your reporters interested in that. And that works with some regularity. And it's comfortable because I don't have to do it right now. But he can say, maybe over the next month we should see if we can pull something together on this topic that seems to be an emerging area.
Now, I don't work in the States, of course, but I thought Congress got its news from Fox.
I stand corrected. If we're going to stay on time, folks, we've probably got time for just one final question, so let's make it wonderful. Yes, ma'am. You will have the floor.
My name is Latifa Boyce, and I'm with the National Institute of Mental Health. Prior to coming to NIH, I had an opportunity to work with Mike Osterholm at the University of Minnesota. Many of you probably know him. This question is, what makes news hot and what makes it timely? Last year, I spent an entire calendar year trying to pitch the whole story behind the avian flu to news organizations and had very much difficulty trying to get the story out. Now it's breaking news, and all of you would take the story in a heartbeat. I want to know what makes it timely, what makes it hot, and why there's some difficulty penetrating, because the science is not new, the predictions are not new, everything that you all are reporting now is not new. So what's the holdup?
Could I? And I understand the frustration, but I think, gentlemen, doesn't it refer to the relevance of it? If people, if it's a water cooler, it's an issue now that people have finally caught on to, and God bless you for the year's worth of work, because we're probably using it now.
Yeah, you are.
We probably are.
Yeah. The thing is, we were writing about the flu. We've been writing about the flu for a year. Were people reading about it? Not particularly. What's happened is the politicians noticed, and the politicians commented on it. So the editors who pay attention to politics all of a sudden said, flu? Right. We need a story on this.
You see? Yeah. Yes.
This is one of the dirty little secrets of journalism, of course. It's just these things snowball for no objective reason sometimes. I have to say, though, I think if you could analyze it completely, I bet you would be able to find some logical reasons, having said that. And I actually think in this case, Katrina was one of those things. People became suddenly very aware of disaster preparedness as a theme, or unpreparedness. And so the ongoing sort of low-level talk about avian flu suddenly had resonance and took off with readers, with journalists, and certainly with politicians. So, these are these sort of stochastic, unpredictable events that come in sometimes and turn what was a good news story but wasn't news into a good news story that is news.
Yes.
I think, unfortunately, there is some truth to the media feeding frenzy phenomenon. We do tend to hunt as a pack, to use another analogy, to a certain extent. Somebody starts it, everybody's talking, everybody wants to be on the same day, in the same cycle, and we kind of increase the momentum ourselves. But also it can be a matter of timing. You've got a great story, but then Katrina happens and your story gets lost. It's just bad luck.
So we're absolved from any responsibility. Sorry. We've had a great panel today. I will encourage you to show them your support. But first and foremost, I do want to ask you to complete your surveys, which are in your registration packets, so that we can get another wonderful panel out again next year. and turn those surveys completed, please, into the registration desk. They'll be looking for that information to get a real sense as to what was effective for you, what worked, what didn't work, and so that next year we can make it even bigger and better. As you sort through to pick those up, please release your hands to applaud for our journalists who have taken time out of their busy days. And I'm sure that they will be looking forward to those who want emails, receiving the email sandwiches from you, those who want phone calls, receiving that information in various ways that you will touch base with them. But remember, this is an opportunity for a two-way street that we refer to as communication, so please do take advantage of it, and I hope that you all have a wonderful day. Thank you for attending.